Moving on now to passage 3 from test 2, numbers 23 to 33. Number 23, environmentalist otters. It has long been known that the sea otters living along the west coast of North America help keep kelp forests in their habitat healthy and vital. Well, looking at the original, nothing seems too wrong here. We're describing the sea otters with this participial phrase in the middle of the sentence. The verb is properly conjugated because this is plural. Help is plural, right? Otters help. That's no issue. So I like A, but again, we always check all four. It has long been known that the sea otters living along the west coast of North America, comma, they help. There's no reason at all to have just one comma here, nor to repeat this subject they. Sea otters that live along the west coast of North America and help too. So here we've got a fragment because now we've got this end when we don't even have any previous verb that can link up with this and help. So by adding the end, we create a fragment. Known that sea otters that live along the west coast of America, comma, where they help keep kelp forests in their habitat healthy and vital. This again would create a fragment by creating this relative clause using the relative adverb where to make essentially another fragment. So we're totally fine with the original, so we're going to stay with choice A. They do this by feeding on urchins and other herbivorous invertebrates that graze voraciously on kelp. With sea otters to keep the population of sea urchins in check, kelp forests can flourish. In fact, 2 years or less of sea otters can completely eliminate sea urchins in a coastal area. See chart. So which choice offers an accurate interpretation of data in the chart? So let's go to the chart and see what we got here. So when there are no otters present, the amount of sea urchins is rather high and the amount of kelp is rather low. When otters are present for 2 years or less, the number of sea urchins drops and the number of kelp increases. And then when they're present for 10 years, there's basically no sea urchins and there's a ton of kelp. So we look at the original, 2 years or less of sea otters can completely eliminate sea urchins. That's not true. It's very close to being eliminated, but not completely. So we can get rid of A. Even 2 years or less of sea otters' presence can reduce the sea urchin threat. Yeah, so 2 years drops this threat quite a bit, increases the kelp by quite a bit. Kelp density increases proportionally as sea urchin density increases. Just the opposite. As sea urchins increase, kelps decrease, and vice versa, as we see from this table. Even after sea otters were present for 10 years or more, kelp density was still lower than sea urchin density. No way. That's completely wrong. So, best answer here is B. Without sea otters present, nevertheless, kelp forests run the danger of becoming barren stretches of coastal wasteland known as urchin barrens. So we do want to show contrast here. However, nevertheless is not quite the right kind of contrast. We would prefer something like however, because without sea otters present, however, kelp forests run the danger. This contrasts directly to what's being discussed previously, that when you've got the otters around, the sea urchins are kept in check and the kelp does well. But without them around, however, the opposite is true. So however, even though however and nevertheless are both contrasting, however works better here because nevertheless is just a different usage of the contrast. So for example, if we had something like all these reasons why kelp were not growing in a particular area, and then we said, nevertheless, sea otters are helpful to, despite all those negative factors, sea otters are helpful to them. That would be a better usage of nevertheless here. However is just more effective in this context, even though they're both contrast. So we can get rid of A. Hence shows cause and effect. It doesn't show contrast. And likewise, again, we want contrast. So best choice here is B. What was less well known, until recently at least, was how this relationship among sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp forests might help fight global warming. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased by 40%. A recent study by 2 professors at the University of California suggests that kelp forests protected by sea otters can absorb as much as 12 times the amount of CO2. Okay, so let's stop there. We want to add this fragment potentially, this part of the sentence here. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, resulting in a rise of global temperatures. So we're talking about global warming, and we're talking about how eventually these sea otters can absorb some of the CO2, which will help cool the earth or keep it from getting it too warm. So do we want to add this fact of that the amount of CO2 has increased 40% since the start of the Industrial Revolution, resulting in a rise in global temperatures? Notice, you might say this is unnecessary information, but it is providing us with a time reference. It's telling us that since this period, CO2 has increased 40%, which has led to a rise in global temperatures. This really is the key portion, that this CO2 has led to a rise in global temperatures. That connects the CO2 with the global warming. So I think we're going to want to make this addition. So no, because it contradicts the claim made in the previous paragraph that sea otters help keep kelp forests healthy. It doesn't contradict that at all. No, because it mentions the Industrial Revolution, blurring the focus of the paragraph. This is, I think, the trap choice here. Sure, it does mention it, but notice it doesn't go on to talk about like, oh, there was this development in the Industrial Revolution, and then this happened, and then this happened. It just uses this as a time reference. Like, imagine if this were a date, like let's say 1700. Would you object to their use of a date here? No. I mean, so they're really just using the Industrial Revolution as a way to date and to give us that time context. It doesn't go into more detail than that, so I don't think it's blurring the focus. Yes, because it establishes the relationship between the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global warming. This is exactly what we want. Yes, because it explains the key role sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp forests play in combating global warming. This sentence does not do that. Later it does, but not in this sentence. So we're going to go with choice A. A recent study by two professors at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Chris Wilmers and James Estes, suggests, that kelp forests protected by sea otters can absorb as much as. Okay, notice here we've got suggests and then that. It suggests that something. Whenever we have this, we're not going to want a comma here. That's not one of our comma usages to separate a verb from this relative pronoun that. Or I guess it's not really a relative pronoun in this case. In any event, it's something that we don't want to use a comma here. It's not one of our rules for comma usage. If you look earlier, these commas all work together as part of these appositive phrases in this opening phrase. So this is all closed off. It's good. We don't need to have a comma here because it separates suggests and that. So we're good with D. We don't need quotes. We don't need a dash. We don't need a comma. So we're good with choice D. So this study suggests that kelp forests protected by sea otters can absorb as much as 12 times the amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as those where sea urchins are allowed to devour the kelp. So we look at the choices. This is a diction question. Devour looks pretty good. I mean, it means to eat a lot of them, and that's kind of the problem with the sea urchins. Dispatch is not quite the right word. To dispatch means to either get rid of or to send a message or to send something, send somebody. That doesn't make any sense here. Overindulge on, it's not that they're overindulging on them, it's just that they're eating them a lot because they like to eat kelp, and that destroys the kelp population. So overindulge just goes too far in the other direction. Dispose of doesn't work. They're not throwing out the kelp, they're eating them. They're not getting rid of them. So for that reason, we can get rid of D, and we're actually okay with the original here. The original word choice is perfectly fine. So this one is A. Like their terrestrial plant cousins, kelp removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turning it into sugar fuel through photosynthesis, and releases oxygen back into the air. So we got to be careful here. This is a pronoun. What is the antecedent? What is the noun this refers to? It refers to kelp. Now, is kelp singular or plural? Now, even if you didn't know whether kelp were singular and plural, notice this verb removes is singular, which is telling us that kelp must be singular, which is telling us that this must be singular. So instead of there, we need the singular possessive pronoun its. So that's why we're going to go with choice C. Notice its it apostrophe s doesn't work. That's short for it is. Like it is terrestrial plant cousins. That's terrible. There and B is the wrong there. Like they are terrestrial plant cousins. No. And then we've already established in A, which is probably the closest choice here that people would put, it's got to be plural because kelp is singular, which we can see from the verb. It's also singular. Like, why is it ultimately singular from the verb? It's singular because you're talking about the class of animal. You're not talking about a bunch of kelps or something. I don't even know if you would pluralize kelp as kelps. In any event, we're talking about the class of kelp, which is singular. It's a group we're treating as a singular group, and therefore it's a singular verb and the singular pronoun its. Let's move on to number 30. Scientists knew this, but did not recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests to significantly decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So here, they, ambiguous pronoun. Who is this referring to? Really, the only one it can refer to in the sentence is the scientists. But of course, the scientists are not the ones keeping or helping the kelp forests. It's the sea otters, basically. So we can get rid of anything that doesn't make that clear. A has got an ambiguous pronoun. B, it, still don't know what the it is referring to. D has the same problem. We don't know what the they is referring to. But the C looks pretty good. Choice C. How large a role sea otters played. So we swapped out they for the noun, which is usually a good way to fix your ambiguous pronouns, because now you know exactly who's doing this action. So for that reason, we like choice C. 31. Far from making no difference to the ecosystem, the presence of otters was found to increase the carbon storage of kelp forests by 4.4 to 8.7 megatons annually, offsetting the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by 3 million to 6 million passenger cars each year. So where is the most logical place in this paragraph to add this sentence? What Wilmers and Estes discovered in their study therefore surprised them. So if we have this sentence, we want a sentence that gives an expectation, followed by a sentence that shows how the expectation is not what they would expect. Let's see. How about, we'll see after sentence 5, this is an interesting place to start because it says, scientists knew this. In fact, they knew this process, but did not recognize how large a role they played in helping kelp forests, blah, 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 blah. What Wilmers and Estes discovered in their study therefore surprised them. It surprised them because scientists did not recognize how large a role sea otters played. So what they discovered surprised them. Far from making no difference, the presence of otters was found to increase, blah, blah. So here, this sentence seems to want to go after sentence 5 and before sentence 6 because it nicely connects what scientists expected to what Wilmers and Estes discovered, which surprised them, to the discovery that they made, that in fact sea otters made quite a big difference beyond what they would have expected on this ecosystem. So for that reason, we would go with D. When we look at sentences 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're not going to get a good flow by adding the sentence after 1, 3, or 4. And you can check them, and I recommend you check them. But you'll see that there's no sense in which we're going to know what or why these scientists were surprised by the results of their study. 32. Wilmers and Estes caution, however, that having more otters will not automatically solve the problem of higher levels of carbon dioxide in the air. So having more otters is okay because at least it's telling us that there are like more otters present, but who's having them? It's a bit odd to say having more otters because no one has more otters. It's like the presence of more otters. So we can get rid of A. Increasing the otter population will not automatically solve the problem of higher levels of CO2. That looks pretty good. Wilmers and Estes caution, however, that the otters multiplying, that's very awkward. D is even worse than the original, that having more otters than other locations will not automatically solve the problem. No, it's all talking about increasing the otter population. If you think they're saying that's a good way to fix global warming, well, not necessarily. Last one, but they suggest that the presence of otters provides a good model of how carbon can be sequestered or removed from the atmosphere through the management of animal populations. Here we've got this opening comma, which we have to keep. So remember, to or none, we're going to have a comma here. Notice a semicolon doesn't work because this is not a complete sentence. So right away, the original is gone. We're going to want a comma after removed, which we see in D, but we don't want a comma after from. We don't want to separate this preposition from the rest of the sentence, right? From the atmosphere. Never did we put a comma after a word like from to separate it from its object, essentially. But we do want to have a comma here because it goes with this to or none rule. And again, you could remove this from the sentence would sound fine. This is basically just defining what sequestered means. So that's how it's acting essentially as an appositive. And so we're going to want 2 commas. And that is choice